Good evening. We are Group 11, which comprises of myself, Emily Flanders, Julian Rochella, and Ifra Ali. The topic of this group presentation is the Columbia disaster, a catastrophic event that took place at NASA and the change management theories and concepts that occurred throughout the case study. I'll begin by discussing the three drivers of change and perspectives, followed by the important aspects missing from NASA's all-development process of management. My teammate Ifra will then provide an overview of the resistance to change, and Julian will outline the culture and ethical issues that arose. The three drivers for change evident in the case include poor morale, cost-cutting, and dysfunctional culture. All three drivers of change are identified as internal drivers, the first being poor morale, which quickly becomes apparent in the case study. An example of this is highlighted when discussing the findings of the CAIB, outlining that the root causes and contributing factors were social and psychological. These issues can have an immediate and obvious impact on workplace morale. Cost cutting is the second internal factor of change. Again, this is mentioned throughout the case when success was instead measured through cost reductions. And a key example is when the engineers highlighted they were forced to reduce costs and to create designs which impacted performance and safety margins. These factors contributed to the dysfunctional culture, the third internal driver for change, namely identified when the case discusses meetings being stifled by professional differences of opinion. The most appropriate perspective for theoretical basis driving the need for change has been identified as the systems perspective, a holistic view that encompasses an organisation on the whole while recognising the link between organisational pieces and how one area impacts another. This perspective envisions that changes in policies and subsystems will be in sync and mutually supporting, which is clearly essential since, in order for NASA to prevent similar tragedies, they need to promptly address not just technical concerns, but also all culture, communication, and decision-making processes. This perspective is identified as it's realistic and recognises that organisations are a habitat of connecting pieces, and any change must take all of those pieces into account. So what was missing? The Warner-Burke 7-step action research approach is the most widely utilised action research approach in the modern context. It can be argued that the most important aspect missing from NASA's all-development is diagnosis and the data gathering and analysis. This is an integral part of the all-development process, as up-to-date and accurate data allows for instructional decisions to be made in confidence. It's obvious this step has not been adhered to correctly and is justified in the case when referring to procedures not reflecting reality and, quote, as financial and time constraints compromise safety standards, the reliance on past success, which created blind spots in engineering practices. Accurate data that is communicated properly is impossible to ignore or silence, and as a result, a trickle-down impact occurred throughout NASA, contributing to the Columbia disaster. I will now pass over to my colleague, Ifra.
Thanks, Emily. Ifra here. I'll be discussing the subject of resistance to change as it relates to the NASA case study. Firstly, what is resistance to organizational change? Well, this is the tendency of individuals, teams, or entire organizations to oppose a change through behaviors, attitudes, and practices that seek to preserve and maintain the status quo within the organization in the face of change. When change resistance occurs within an organization, the organization becomes more rigid with respect to the constantly changing operation environment. As such, with their inability to adapt to the changing environment, change-resistant organizations are almost always bound to fail since they cannot operate sustainably. Therefore, the factors that lead to change resistance should be first addressed for any change initiative within an organization to be effective. In class, we have learned 4 forms of resistance to change, which are psychological, systems, institutionalized, and culture. From the case study, there are many reasons for resistance to change, but I'll be discussing 2 key resistors which played a big role in the Columbia disaster. Next slide, please. The 2 types of organizational change are institutionalized change resistance and the resistance due to organizational culture. Institutionalized change resistance is the change resistance that arises from the structure and processes within the organization. The structure at NASA organization was a tall and firm hierarchy that hindered collective decision making. In this tall organizational hierarchy, the managers controlled and dictated all the decisions made regarding the flight schedules and other decisions on various missions. For instance, in this case, Warning signs were dismissed. Engineers were concerned about potential difficulties and unrealistic schedule pressure to complete their projects. Senior NASA management hadn't sufficiently understood their employee concerns, becoming complacent, and began to question the need for all the red tape. As a result, upper management was unwilling to adapt due to their bureaucratic mindset. These unilateral decisions were made in disregard of concerns by engineers. Therefore, NASA's managers failed to ensure that employee voices were heard. The consequence of this tall hierarchy is that the safety concerns were not addressed. Poor and outdated procedures were still being utilized, leading to the Columbia disaster. On the other hand, change resistance due to organizational culture arises from the nature of the relationships within the firm. In this case, the culture at NASA was focused on past successes as a gauge for current decisions and actions rather than sound engineering and safety practices. NASA's culture of bureaucracy and process was also prioritized over thoroughness and reason, ultimately the cause of the tragedy. There were glaring gaps in organizational communications, leading to safety and engineering concerns not being effectively acted upon. Consequently, professionals' opinions were often curtailed due to external political influences on NASA and financial constraints on their budget, with little margin to deal with the unexpected technical problems or make shuttle improvements. Furthermore, NASA has a disintegrated organizational structure with various units geographically spread across the US with little to no coordination across the various units. Now I'll pass it on to Julian to discuss the culture that NASA was exhibiting.
Thank you, Ifrah. My name is Julian, and I'll be talking about the culture that NASA were exhibiting in the lead up to the Columbia disaster, as well as the link between resistance to change and ethics and the main ethical issue that became apparent. Wilson highlights three cultural perspectives that NASA were exhibiting in the lead up to the Columbia disaster, which are the integration perspective, differentiation perspective, and fragmentation perspective. The integration perspective refers to a desirable culture within a workplace where there is an agreement throughout the organization on the behaviors that should take place. In this case, the integration perspective was not displayed at NASA. The differentiation perspective highlights the fact that there will be differences within an organization and that conflicting ideas will most likely exist. This is relevant in the Columbia disaster case at NASA as there were professional differences of opinion, which leads to miscommunication and a lack of integration. It was stated in the case study that management lacked integration across programs. Lastly, the fragmentation perspective refers to ambiguity as a norm and is demonstrated through a lack of consistency within an organization through constantly fluctuating patterns influenced by events and decision making. For instance, in the NASA case, there were organizational communication issues that arose from a lack of consistent budgeting and unstable political issues. Moving on, the main ethical issue was ignored through NASA's resistance to change was their internal issues with management, who relied on their previous reputation of safe engineering practices that allowed for them to cut corners with safety regulations. Dent and Goldberg defined resistance to change as a behavior which is intended to protect an individual from the effects of any real or perceived change. This was apparent within the case as NASA were resistant to changes of continuing to develop as a company, as they wanted to rely on their previous reputation. NASA's culture and perspectives did not reflect reality, and their new company traits were poor communication, lack of resources, and fluctuating priorities. Resistance to change may lead to negative behaviors such as poor morale, uncooperative behavior, and potential for conflict, which may then lead to ethical difficulties. Van Tonder highlights the ethical changes that took place in NASA's management that became apparent through the resistance to change. Poor communication was a major factor in NASA's Columbia disaster, as well as their disregard for employees and their poor implementation of safety strategies. Thank you for listening to our speech on NASA's Columbia disaster and the relevant change management theories and concepts.